what we did so far was to quickly go through Indian economic history, from 1947 to 2000, at least till 1991. So I want to spend the next half an hour or so, next half an hour, 40 minutes, to try and see what the major economic outcomes were. And and I'm going to spend some time on this graph, which is, again, I take the point that, remember, development is multidimensional, and we're going to come to some of the other things later on. But economic growth is a fundamental determinant of standards of living and economic development. And just to look at what has happened in terms of outcome in terms of Indian economic growth. So here is a chart, and on the x-axis is just time from 50-51 to 2016-17. Notice that unfortunately the y-axis is not labeled. I think we should do that. I think the y-axis is log per capita GDP, so that what you will see slopes, between any 2 points in time, the change in log is the slope. So if you started the clock of Indian economic history, say in 1950-51, I would say that there are so far 1, 2, 3, 4 phases. The first phase between 50-51 and about 1980-81 or 1979 is a term that goes back to one of India's great academics and great teachers, Professor Raj Krishna, who used to teach at the Delhi School of Economics. He was an agricultural expert, a growth expert. He coined this term, the Hindu rate of growth. Essentially, what he was saying then was the Hindu rate of growth is about good but not exceptional performance. And the Hindu part, again, I'm ascribing to him, it's not my view, essentially that, Indians are more concerned with the hereafter, and so they're not that bothered. As long as it's steady and chugging along, things are fine. In fact, the next chart has the growth rates. So between 50-51 and 80-81, the overall rate of economic growth was 3.4% per year, annual average. And in per capita terms, it was 1.3. So roughly, population growth was about 2%, and economic growth was close to 3.5%. And if per capita growth is 1.3%, just a simple thing you should keep in mind, it will probably take 50 or so years, you should work out the arithmetic, to double the standard of living. It's 1.013 raised to whatever, that will give you a doubling of the income. So it's probably, someone should check the arithmetic, the magic of compound interest, and then, so it's actually very, very slow growth, because standards of living double after, 1.5, 2 generations. Now, then what happened was, around 80, 81, 79, 88, around 1980, India's growth rate dramatically changed. So in the period between about 79, 80 and 2012, 13, until the period 2002, 3, so from here to here, the takeoff period, overall economic growth was 5.5, and we can actually write that down, 5.5, and per capita growth rate was 3.4. So essentially we grow from about 1.3% per capita to 3.4% per capita. Now 3.4% per capita, you double incomes in much less than a generation. So something significant happened and Indian economic growth took off. So that's the second phase. Then we had the third phase beginning around 2002, 2003. For about 8 years, 7 to 8 years, was our boom period. This was kind of India shining. People said we're going to overtake China. It was a period of great boom. And then total growth rate was 7.6% and per capita was 6.1. So notice already how population growth is also slowing down over these 3 periods. Now, what's going to follow thereafter, it remains to be seen, but we're in that 4th phase, whether it'll be 5, 7, 8, some of you teaching this course 10 years from now, 15 years from now, will be able to update that analysis. So the first point to make, and the point that Professor Pulapre Balakrishnan makes, is that this Hindu rate of growth, his contention, is that it's actually not too bad. We've lamented it because, see, remember that this is a joke I crack many times. I hope none of you has heard it. When people always ask for assessments, good, bad, right, wrong, whatever, all of this is always relative to a frame of reference, some benchmark that we have. Like they say, the economist's wife turns to the economist and says, honey, do you love me? And he says, relative to what? So in a sense, this is that question, right? So when we look at Hindu rate of growth, per capita 1.3%, we now today compare it with China or with other East Asian countries, because in that period, a number of East Asian countries were growing very rapidly. But another frame of relative to what Professor Balakrishnan says is that if you compare that with colonial India, 1900 to 1950, actually there was a significant improvement. In fact, on the next chart, if you turn to your next chart, you find that between 1900 and 1950, per capita, you'll see it, sorry, okay, this is the one, so I can take you to the next one. This is, I'm going to come back, just focus on India, the blue line, and that number here, 0.2%. And so you come back to the fact, so relative to what? India did quite well. Now, this picture is actually the basis of a paper that Danny Roderick, who's a professor at Harvard, and I wrote, called From Hindu Growth to Rapid Productivity, the Mystery of the Indian Growth Transition. So essentially, the point we made was this. We wrote this at around 2003, 2004. Notice that, the big reform in India happened when? Big Bang, we just did that, 1991. And this line here, this green line, is the year we had the crisis, the macroeconomic crisis, and the Big Bang reform. So the point we made was that, hey, the change in India's growth occurred around 80, 81, not 91. Because if you look at the slope, the change in the slope, this slope here is pretty much the same as this slope here. So we said, this is extremely interesting. It's a bit of a puzzle. Why did this happen? And so the whole paper, so there's a massive debate out there saying Roderick Subramaniam are wrong. Some people say they're right.
Perhaps you might have argued that it was supply-led.
Exactly. So I think, I would urge you to go and read the paper in terms of, yeah, very good, well done. So I would urge more of you to read it. There's also, read also the criticisms of the paper. But this is a very striking fact. So we were in fact taking on a little bit the free marketeers and others who said, look, you needed reform to get growth, but in fact, growth preceded reforms by 10 years. So the question was why? So this was the big debate that we had. And then I think this is a very, very interesting question. The second, two or three other points I'd note here, which are very interesting, is that if you look at broader Indian economic history, say 1950 to 20, so let's say this is about 65 years, we forget actually that for nearly half that time, or more than half the time, India has grown very rapidly. And kind of the Hindu rate is about 25, 30 years. but actually very good performance is also 25, 30 years. So, to borrow that line from Keshto, who in answer to everything he says, pipti. So this is also, 50% of the time we had reasonable growth and only 50% Hindu rate of growth. So it's something worth keeping in mind, because there are very few countries, and we'll come to that at the end, very few countries, very few democracies that have actually posted such high rates of growth for such a long period of time. It's not something that's happened very often in post-war history. So that's the first point. The second thing is that, so when I used to go around making these presentations, I would ask everyone a quiz, pose a question. Okay, India and China. Did India's growth pick up 10 years after China, 15 years after China, 20 years after China, or at the same time as China? And invariably the answer would be 10 years, 15 years, etc., etc. But in fact, the Indian growth turnaround and the Chinese growth turnaround happened exactly at almost the same point in history. I'm going to show you Chinese growth takes off in, this should be in log terms. You see, someone said earlier for some time, even in up to 1980 or whatever, 1990, India's growth was higher. But you notice that growth rates, essentially, Chinese growth rate takes off in 1978, and the Indian growth rate takes off around 79, 80. So the only difference, of course, is that China grew much more rapidly than India did. So if you look, for example, if these numbers are right, in the period 1980 to 2002, India grew at 3.4, China grew at 7.6. After 2002, China grew at 9.5, India grew at 6.1. I mean, to grow at 7.68% per capita per year, that means standards of living are doubling, I don't know, every 15, 16 years, so that over a generation, you kind of increase your standard of living 3 or 4 times, and that's precisely what's been happening in China. So bottom line is that here, Indian economic history is actually very interesting. Some period of somewhat mediocre performance, but that was only for less than half the time. Most of the time, we've had very rapid rates of economic growth. The boom that we saw actually was a boom that was enjoyed by many, many countries around the world. That was a period where, advanced economies, emerging economies, all of them grew, but China and India grew especially rapidly. And the big puzzle, the question that we posed was, how come economic growth took off 10 years before radical reform? So I think this is kind of, for me, a really interesting, and so if there are any questions on this while I sip my espresso, I'm happy to take questions on that. But only questions, please.
Previous slide. The previous one, the China-India war. Right. Yeah, this one. See, there is a literature which says that Chinese economy consistently grew for more than 6%, more than 6%.
No. So Chinese per capita growth has been almost 8 to 8.5 for 35, 40 years. So it's a much faster, rapid rate of growth. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
80 till 2003 remained almost the same. You showed also the slope lines. But then, in spite of 1991 crisis, still we maintained that. Probably because had crisis not been there, there would have been definitely a huge jump. Am I right?
See, okay, so there are two ways of arguing it, and this is what I think, I don't want to go into too much into, the papers that I wrote, because, you might think that, there's a lot more wisdom than beyond the papers that I've wrote. But here the interesting point is that one view says that, had there been no crisis, would have been faster growth. That's your view. But the other view is that, to which I'm a little bit more partial to, is that had we not had the crisis, we may not have had the reforms that then generated this rapid growth. So there are both views on that. Yeah. And in fact, so just to summarize what we said, essentially, one way to think about the 80s and the 90s in India, and this is the point that Danny and I made, in the 80s, we got much more internal reform, not external reform. In the 1980s, it was much more what we call pro-business rather than pro-competition. Because remember, what we did in the 80s was gradually liberalized licensing, gradually increased access to foreign exchange for existing producers. In 1990s, when we exposed the economy to more competition, which threatened, existing producers. So the distinction is between in the 80s, we saw pro-business reform, internal reform. After the crisis, we saw pro-competition and external reform, much more wide-reaching reform. So, but that's kind of broadly our explanation for what happened. Okay, so
I have one question regarding again India-China.
Yeah.
Next slide. Next. That is yeah. I mean, Chinese data has always been doubtful, more so in the past. In China, I mean, the food supply has been more than us, even in 1980s. They had achieved nearly universal education and better healthcare even before 1980s. So, I mean, how can we say that their per capita income was lower than us, while we see that all other indicators, including food availability as well as health and education, are better than us at that point of time. And even the industrial output was higher than us. I mean, in terms of share of industry in terms of GDP was around 40-44% at the time of 1980.
Yeah, so the question is, how could China be below India at a time when its human development, say, indicators were above India's? I think that, I don't want to go too much into this, but remember that China had a lot of upheavals preceding 1979-80. And so in a sense it was catching up, because after all, after 57, after the Cultural Revolution, a lot of bad stuff happened which depressed us. And also the second point is that, even in places like India, it's possible that for over some periods of time, your human development indicators couldn't be ahead of your economic indicators. Is essentially that what we think is that over very long periods of time, you need human development indicators to sustain better economic performance. But over shorter periods of time, you can have some. I mean, for example, Kerala, for example, its human development indicators are much better than the income indicators. So that's possible to happen over time. Yeah. Yeah. And then we'll move on.
Do you think that international financial architecture, in terms of exchange rate regimes, in terms of capital mobility, also could have played an important role in explaining the growth differentials across these periods?
So I want to preserve discussion on that until we come to the crisis section. But broadly, what you should keep in mind, not as an explanation which we'll come to, but as a fact, is that for China still has more restrictions on some kinds of capital flows than India does. On FDI, China was ahead of us, foreign direct investment, but now we're slowly catching up. But on portfolio flows, financial flows, China has always been, and even today, is much more closed than we are. And there's a reason for that, which we'll come to when we discuss the monetary trilemma and so on. Okay, so let's move on to going through Indian economic history a little bit rapidly now. So, this is just to show, this is just some set of facts. Steady decline in poverty. In 73-74, total poverty was 54.9. Today, it is 2011-12, according to Tendulkar, it's 22. So a fairly rapid reduction in poverty. But of course, the reduction in poverty in India has not been as rapid as in China. I think for two reasons. One, obviously, agricultural growth and rural growth were much greater. So if you go faster, you will achieve more reduction in poverty. But also Chinese growth, at least for some time, was much more inclusive, and that also accounted for that. So this, I think, is just a fact that we should all be aware of. Now, just going back to this, I think as a coming back, because at every point in time, I want all of us to keep in mind, how will we teach this to our students, right? And I think this is, so when you discuss something like this, what are the things and how can we show this to students? And I would say, for example, that there are many exercises that one can do with this. For example, to give you one, just because Roderick and Subramaniam say that the break happened in 1980, may not necessarily be true. Statistical techniques exist which say, well, maybe it's not 79-80, maybe it was 83-84. So these are exercises that you can, for example, get your students to do. Also, the kind of question that you asked, had we not had the crisis of 1991, could growth have been faster? The other thing, another very interesting question is looking at what happened to investment and savings in these two periods of time. Is it the case that there was a big turnaround in investment? When we say, for example, the growth turnaround happened, was there a big increase in investment here? Or was a big increase in investment here? Or was it a big increase in investment here? These are things that I think you could get your students to think about more carefully. In the paper itself, for example, we show that in this first period here, India's trade doesn't take off that much. The big improvement in trade happens here and then here. So the question is then, how did we achieve 10 years of such rapid growth without trade taking off? So there are lots of interesting questions and exercises that one can get, the students to do. And I think we should keep that in mind when we, teach them economic growth and the history of economic growth in India. Yeah, question.
Small question. When Deng started reforms in China, his team gave a lot of importance to the small and micro enterprises and the idea of cooperatives. And as we know that the distribution of the growth was, in case of China, it was more inclusive. It could not happen in India. So do you think that if we had given due importance to this sector, to these tiny units, at the time of economic reforms, the big bang we talk about, we would have got a better scenario today?
So the question is a very good question. Is it the differential in performance between China and India? Is it because China gave more emphasis to small and medium enterprises and India did not? Two responses to that, right? One, as we've seen, India has given a lot of emphasis to small and medium enterprises throughout its history, including, for example, some things, 1,000 products can only be produced by the small scale sector. No competition for that. Tax concessions only for the small scale sector. So I think India has done a lot to promote that. It's just that it didn't work like it did in China. That's the point. But the second interesting point, I think you make and this is actually a fascinating point about China that at some stage I think you should read up and get your students to read up. So here's the thing, that China's first big reform was agriculture. 1978, the first thing that Deng Xiaoping came and said was, we are going to have a household responsibility system for agriculture. What does that mean? Until then, all farmers had to produce and give everything to the state. What Deng came and said was, look, we're not going to reform China wholesale. No, because that will run into a lot of political trouble. So what he said was, all farmers, up to a certain point, you have to give the state, but anything above that you produce, you keep for yourself. That's the way he brought in incentives in agriculture.
You can take that to the market.
Yeah, that's what you can keep it and sell it yourself. But the second thing which relates to your question is, after that, essentially the big driver of growth was what were called TVEs, township and village enterprises. Small units that did a lot, right? But And here I'm going to just walk around a little bit to, come closer to my friends in the northwest corner here, who are a little bit more, who've been neglected by me. But here's the interesting thing, the contrast between China and India, that we emphasized our small-scale enterprises, but it seemed to act like a tax on the big guys. What China did was this: township and village enterprises, but they were the dynamism and motor for growth for about 10 to 12, 15 years. After that, foreign direct investment came in and became the big driver of. How did they successfully transition from small to big without not just the economic changes, but the political changes? How did they achieve that? That's a very, very interesting question about China that I think we should all think about. So for me, if I were teaching, I would teach one course just on India and Chinese economic history, and then, have all these discussions about, how did they do it? How did we do it? What's the difference between them and us? And all these questions. I think we can't monopolize the question. I need to move on as well. Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit dictatorial. I'm going to be like a Chinese rather than an Indian here. Okay. Now, again, this is research done by Professor Devesh Kapoor and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, this relates to the question that came up, right? Guarantees. Did they work or did they not work? Now, they did some work. This is Devesh Kapoor and his things. They went and did these surveys of 2 villages, one in eastern Uttar Pradesh and one in western Uttar Pradesh, between 1990 and about 2007. What they found was that not only were there dramatic improvements in economic standards of living, more income, more access to consumer goods, etc., but they also found that there were seismic social transformations. So, for example, things like, would Dalits and non-Dalits be seated separately at weddings? And what happens is that between 1990 and 2007, dramatic improvements. Only Dalits lift dead animals, dramatic decline, less dramatic, but some decline as well. So what they argue is that, some combination of political power and guarantees, some combination of that with, access to education, plus growth has in fact, contrary to what people might think about India, has led to a lot of social transformation, and it's a social transformation that goes way beyond just economic transformation, because this is fundamental to how people think about themselves, their identities. So this is about economic development, to go back to a question, in a much broader sense. And I think this is something, again, it's an Economic and Political Weekly article. I know you could kind of, it's very easy reading even for second and third year students. No heavy duty econometrics or regressions is something that you could certainly prescribe for students to read to understand this.
Sir, I just want to raise one question regarding this last slide. I think this last point, only Dalit lift dead animals, has something wrong, in the sense that maybe the livestock, number of livestock has gone down from 1990 to 2007, and because of change of occupation. Otherwise, I don't see any dramatic change in this scenario from 72.6 to 5.3. They may be because of the number of the livestock.
These are all in percentages, but something worth investigating. Yeah, you should go, again. Question. Yeah.
I mean, do these percentages represent seismic social transformations? As you have titled.
It's a good question. I'm going to say relative to what, once again, right? I mean, see,
to what we see right now.
Okay, so here, let me give you an answer. It's an answer that the authors themselves gave. I think the answer that the authors gave of this is that they, I think, would think of this as seismic. I mean, I think, you know, in some cases the numbers are big, 4 to 62, 1 to 72, etc., right? But I think the bigger point they make is that if you look at similar social institutions in Europe, like feudalism, for example, it took much longer to break that down, whereas these changes seem to have happened over more compressed periods of time. So that's the broader thing that they say. I mean, you can always dispute, you know, what is quick, what is slow, and so on.
My concern is with the fact that, okay, these might be changes which are visible. Okay, that, okay, the percentage of, say, 26.9 to 82.1. Fine, that, okay, Dalits and non-Dalits, both of them are sitting there. But could it be a proxy for the fact that, okay, there is a larger seismic social transformation? Because this might be visible that, okay, both of them are sitting, but still there exists a deep down divide. Right?
Yeah. So I mean, so the question is that, are these indicators, do they capture well enough what is happening? That's the question. But you know, that's of course open to question. This is research based on surveys. But I think in defense of this research, they do it for so many indicators that, you know, you think that, you know, progress is being made. Okay. So now I'm going to go to the last part of this. Which is, remember I spoke about the precocious Indian model, i.e. India doing things far ahead of its time. We saw that in a political sense because India has sustained democracy at very, very low levels of income. But here, what you're going to see is also similar things happening on the economic dimension, but not necessarily, again, this is going to be descriptive. It's not necessarily going to say good or bad for reasons that I will explain in just a second. So what follows mostly is work that, Raghuram Rajan and I and co-authors did at the IMF. So the first thing which everyone has noticed is that, you know, India's pattern of development has been much more services intensive than manufacturing intensive. So for example, the contrast is, look at the Indian share of manufacturing here, look at the Chinese share of manufacturing. And in contrast, look at Indian share of services and the Chinese share of services, which is only now slowly rising to Indian levels. So point number one, in terms of why precocious, normally, if you look, and I'm going to show this to you later more systematically, is that over the course of development, say for these advanced countries, you know, agriculture declines, manufacture picks up and then peaks, and services picks up only late in the development process. But here in the case of India, manufacturing has never really picked up, and really services picked up. So it's a services intensive, not a manufacturing intensive pattern of development, and which is a sequencing which is very different from what other countries have done. The other example, this is again based on work that's been done, is that what you find is that India's manufacturing peaked at very low levels of income. And that's what you see here. When you compare this with other countries, on the right-hand side, you see all the advanced economies. So on the x-axis, you have income at which employment peaks. And on the y-axis, you have the share of manufacturing share in total employment. Look at that Indian number. It's about 12 to 14%. And remember, this is actually registered and unregistered manufacturing. And I'm going to tell you why in India, unregistered manufacturing is not like registered manufacturing. It's not high productivity. It's not high wage paying. So in that sense, you know, India has been deindustrializing well before other countries did. I think this is a very interesting thing as well. You know, people have always noticed the contrast between India and China in terms of GDP inflows, right? You see here, China has been consistently above India for long periods of time, and India is only catching up recently. But the interesting thing is that India has been an exporter of FDI, almost similar to China. And this is very, very interesting because when you export FDI, when you think about foreign direct investment, it is not low skill. Foreign direct investment is about high skill, technology, finance. That's what foreign direct investment is about. And India, you think, is a country that has abundant labor and doesn't have that much, should in principle be doing more low-skilled activity. But the fact that we've been exporting FDI shows that, in fact, we have been specializing in high-skilled activities, and that's why we've been, exporting. That's why whether you look at whether we do services or manufacturing, we do more skill. If you look within manufacturing as well, we tend to do more skill-intensive and capital-intensive activities than low-skill-intensive activities. And the fact that we export FDI also shows that we have behaved like a country that has a lot of high skill rather than a country that has had a lot of low skill. And so this is the paradoxical thing. This is why India is precocious. I'll just show you one thing. Again, this is a complicated chart. It shows you for a bunch of emerging market countries how much you produce of very skill intensive relative to less skill intensive activity. That's what measured on the y-axis. So as you go up the y-axis, that means you're doing relatively more skill. If you go up this way, you're doing more skill intensive activity. And this is per capita GDP. And you see, this is India. And it is above China in manufacturing. So, even though China has been way ahead of us, we are doing more skill-intensive activity, even in manufacturing, at relatively low levels of income. And that's the sense in which we are a precocious economy, not a regular economy in that sense. So I just want to end this section. At the end of every module that you're going to get a set of recommended readings. Now, these are readings not just for you, but not just for your students, but also for you. I'm sure many of you may have read them, but this is something that I would like to put it as part of every module, because from the point of view of teaching, making things interesting, what are the things that people should read. So some are short articles, some are books, and you have to decide based on your interest, that of the students, what the aptitude is, what you want to recommend for them. And so I've actually forgot, and this is something I should have been said before, that I have, if you go to, we should have put it up, I have a reading list on development issues, which we'll post later on, which will give you this and many, many more books and articles, and also journalistic articles, more serious articles, academic articles. And I do think that, so just as a point of teaching and pedagogy, when I teach things like this, economic development, even when we come to the more technical subjects, I think it helps to have a balance between simple readings, maybe some gossip, maybe some politics, maybe personalities, and then maybe some serious stuff as well. So I think that's something that is something I find very useful and important to keep in mind when we're trying to teach subjects like this, which can sometimes be dry to students. So before we transition, I would like to get questions from my neglected friends in the northeast corner and the northwest corner. So, yes.
Thank you for this very fascinating lecture. So I just have one thing that I was thinking, that probably in case of the premature deindustrialization, or rather industrialization in India, so I believe that perhaps it is the reason that India found that that we are a country with abundant of less skilled laborers, so we abundant of unskilled or low skilled laborers. But we have learning potential and potential of being competitive in service. So that's why actually we have specialized in skill-intensive service. But we have not actually really put our legs in two sides, because probably one of the reasons, probably because of that, most of the low-skill intensive manufacturing activities are small-scale industries. So that's why we cannot reap the benefits of economies of scale. Which in case of China, I think exactly opposite has happened, because they have actually, so that's why probably this distinction has come. And also I think that, as you have rightly pointed out, that in 1980s, during the 1980s, so there was that kind of boost we have, so that actually helped us. So do you think that that whenever we are asking the students that what do you think the possible explanation of premature deindustrialization in India, then do you think that we should bring all these points?
Yeah, so we will do premature deindustrialization in more detail in, I think, in module 8 or 9, when we can come into this, that we can have a longer discussion on that. But, you know, I think this is a really fascinating and new subject. You know, research on this is just being done. So I think these are things. So that's I think, another, I would say, a kind of teaching device or a pedagogical trick that even when we teach economic history or what happened, you know, in the past, I think to try and make it come alive with current topics, you know, in the academic, in the policy realm, I think that's, really, really important to catch the imagination of students. So I think, so that's a very fair point. I'll take one more question from this corner. And can I move across or no chance? Okay, let's take one question from this side, yeah.
So the last slide that you showed, wherein the ratio of value added is higher in India compared to China, I was just thinking that why then there is a case that the value addition shared in GDO in India is falling as compared to China. So if we have a higher ratio of value addition, say skill intensity as you define, then why is the case that the share of value addition in value of output is declining?
So you know, that's a good question. I would like to, we are going to do something on GDP measurement in India, but here I would just say that this is firstly a ratio. It's, you know, it's not a total amount. And what we will see is that in India, that formal manufacturing, which has the higher value added, we see that its share in total thing is not increasing. So we're not increasing the size of the high productive manufacturing sector, and that we'll discuss later on. Yep. So I think we've finished one module. I want to breathe a sigh of relief that one is over and only 13 are left to go. I know. Okay, one last question. We'll come back to you later. So sorry, you get a one question. Yeah.
Three big observations that you made. One is bypassing manufacturing. The second is outward FDI flows. And the third is high-skilled. All of these three, can we also conclude that the nature of inequality in India would be very different from the nature of inequality in China?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, this is one you know, dimension to, you know, inclusive growth versus, you know, non-inclusive growth. The more you involve your factors that are in abundant supply, which is unskilled and low-skilled labor, the more inclusive growth is likely to be. The more you do rely on factors that are scarce, that have a premium, and that represent a very small section of overall labor force, you know, the less inclusive it's going to be. Absolutely. And this is something that I think we should all keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going to, shall we take a break now? Yeah, let's take a break, very quick break. It's 3:49. 4 o'clock sharp, we begin with module 2, for which you have, and please come back reinforced, because in some ways this is kind of interesting storytelling, and, you know, all of you. Now we're going to get into a little bit more technical kind of, so I need your attention, your patience, and undivided attention and patience, because we're going to do a little bit more technical stuff, but I think it's very important. So as I said, the balance between, you know, storytelling, narrative, and actually hardcore technical stuff is something we need to keep in mind. So we're going to plunge into some technical stuff now after this.